like to welcome you to today's program on behalf of the Jordan Center for Persian Studies. And I assume many of you, as I can see, are students in the History of Zoroastrianism class, Ancient Persian one, and actually a few more students, which is very good. I am happy to introduce one of the major authorities in Zoroastrian studies, who luckily resides in Orange County, Dr. Jenny Rose. Dr. Jenny Rose teaches Zoroastrian studies at the School of Religion, Claremont Graduate University. She holds a doctorate in ancient Iranian studies from Columbia University, and her dissertation was published in 2000, year 2000, with the title of The Image of Zoroaster, the Persian Mage Through European Eyes. In 2011, Dr. Rose published Zoroastrianism, An Introduction, this textbook, in fact, which we use for our class, and I'm quite thankful that you have published that, as well as another book called Zoroastrianism, A Guide for the Perplexed, which is now actually for sale. So if you're interested after the talk, I think Dr. Rose will be available to sign it for you if you would purchase the book. Both of these books have given us the tools which is needed, I think, to understand and in many ways teach Zoroastrianism in the West. And so we're thankful for her endeavor. Dr. Rose lectures extensively at other institutions, museums, and Zoroastrian Association events throughout North America and Europe. She also leads study tours of some of the most important archaeological, cultural, and devotional sites in Iran as well as Central Asia, actually. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rose, who will be talking about exploring Zoroastrianisms, the ancient Persian conundrum. Thank
you. Can you hear me okay? I'd like to thank Professor Daryai and the Center for Persian Studies at UCI for inviting me to be here today. You can tell I'm not a native of Ireland. So if there are words that I say that you don't understand, I'll try and Americanize them for you. I want to say from the get-go that I didn't choose the title for either of these books. I was expecting to talk about this one today, so I will a little bit, but I'll also talk about the subject matter is obviously the same. It's about the Zoroastrian religion. They're both about the Zoroastrian religion, but they do take slightly different approaches and include different materials. The reason that I want to make it clear that I didn't choose the title is that I don't like the notion of an ism, and I'll explain that to you in a bit. But both the publishers insisted that I should provide I should use a one-word descriptor for the religion, since that fitted in with the titles of the other books in their series. One of the initial reasons for me being hesitant to use the term Zoroastrianism was because that's a term that is going out of favour with the Zoroastrian communities around the world and the adherents of the faith itself. Partly because they see it as a Western construct. It's a term that comes into vogue in the late 19th century and is part of a kind of Western scholarly attempt to codify the religion, to contain the religion. For many Zoroastrians today, the term that is preferred is Zarathushtridin or Zarathustrianism, or which Zarathushtridin translates as the religion of Zarathustra, and it goes back to the authentic Iranian name for the founder of the religion. Another term that is used as a more ancient Iranian term, Mazda Yazna, which means the worship of Mazda, Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord, who is the focus of praise and worship from the very earliest of the Zoroastrian texts onwards. So that was one reason for my hesitancy in using the term Zoroastrianism. Another reason is, as I said before, that I don't like the concept of an ism. My son is in 9th grade English, And some of you will remember being in ninth grade English and having to learn the roots of words. One of the roots that he had to learn last week was ism, which was defined as a doctrine or a codified body of teaching. And of course, when you think about all those isms, Zoroastrianism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, and the itty that is Christianity, what the ism bit does is to imply that the religion is the same, is always the same from the moment of its conception, to the present day. And of course, no religion is a monolith. All religions evolve and change as the human condition evolves and the surrounding world changes. And I wanted both of these books to reflect that notion of change. But of course, at the core of the religion, there are certain themes that do continue. So in this book particularly, I tried to draw out what I thought were the main themes, the earliest themes, and show how they continue vertically down through history to the present period. There's, of course, a horizontal notion to an ism too, the idea that once a religion comes into being, then it, wherever it is in the world, or whatever culture it finds itself in, it develops along a similar path. And of course we know that that isn't the case. When Iranists were used to talk of the Zoroastrianism of the Sasanian period, for instance. The Sasanian period lasts from the early 3rd century of the Common Era to the mid-7th century of the Common Era. They would assume that what was understood by Zoroastrianism was the orthodoxy that was represented in the Middle Persian priestly writings. Well, towards the end of the last century, scholars started looking at what was happening to the west and to the east of the Caspian Sea. And my professor at Columbia, James Russell, wrote about the Zoroastrianism of Armenia. And that shed a whole new light on what was happening in the religion and with the religion during the Sasanian period. And in about the same time, Boris Marshak was digging in Panjkent, which is now in Tajikistan, and discovering a whole new aspect of the religion that was manifest in the Sogdian lands that cover Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and parts of Turkmenistan. And Franz Grenet has taken up that area of discovery. And also we find to the east of Iran, in Afghanistan and Pakistan, you have studies of Kushan, Kushan koyans. Now the Kushans were originally thought to be Buddhist, but if you read some of the recent writings by Joe Cribb, who's a numismatist at the British Museum, his latest theory is that the Kushans were officially Zoroastrian and may just have been privately Buddhist. And that, of course, puts a whole new dimension then onto what we understand of as Zoroastrianism in that period. What I'm here to talk about today is exploring that vertical and horizontal range of Zoroastrianisms as we find it being manifest during the ancient Persian period. We don't have much tangible internal material concerning the infrastructure of the religion from the early period. So it's hard to know what to say about the ancient Persians. That's the conundrum in the title of my talk. Because we don't know an awful lot about the religion, how can we say that it was Zoroastrian? And we also don't know an awful lot about Zoroastrianism at that period, so how can we apply that to the ancient Persians? It's a riddle, and I'm not promising to resolve that riddle today. What we can do, what are our sources? Well, we look to, it's with Cyrus the Great that we have our first tangible materials. Turaj, or is he?
Just that's that.
Turaj was just saying, that in class this week you're moving, those of you who are doing Zoroastrian studies, you're moving into the ancient Persian period. And that's great because you've got rocks that you can touch and inscriptions that you can look at. As soon as you get into a period of historical evidence, then you can start analysing a people's response to the world around them. What was their world view? So we have monumental art and architecture from Cyrus the Great, Cyrus II. We have inscriptions and iconography and archives from Persepolis, mostly dating to the time of Darius I, also Xerxes, and some material relating to Artaxerxes II. And these tell us a little bit about the beliefs and practices of the ancient Persians. There are also outsider accounts, Babylonian, Egyptian, and Greek that we have to take into account. And it's only really recently that some of these materials have started to be looked at in a kind of comparative way. In terms of Greek sources, one of our primary sources is, of course, the histories of Herodotus, the so-called father of history. But, of course, we also have to recognise that that is a somewhat biased account. What is significant to note is that Herodotus in his histories and Xenophon in his Cyropedia don't mention the name Zoroaster at all. So we know that as a self-definition, the ancient Persians didn't classify themselves as Zoroastrian, at least in their official documentation and in their dealings with the people that they came into contact with. Do they belong within the general spectrum of Zoroastrianism? We know certainly that from the time of Darius onwards, they refer to themselves as Mazda worshippers. And of course, Mazda worship is the core of the Avestan worldview, the Zoroastrian worldview. I said it's with Cyrus the Great that we start to have both internal and external tangible evidence of the ancient Persians and their worldview. But I've begun with this 4th century gold ornament as a reminder that, of course, most of what we know relates to the elite, to the nobles, to the kings. Not very much, I'm sorry, those of you who are doing gender studies, there's not much on women either. So we know more about the elite than we do about ordinary people. But I guess that's true for many periods of history. This is one of our first tangible objects, and it comes from Babylon, and it is Babylonian. It's not internally Persian. Some of you will recognise it. When Cyrus took Babylon in 539, his conquest was recorded on this cylinder. It's a foundation document that was found in the ruins of the walls of Babylon in the late 19th century, near to the temple of Marduk, who was the chief god of the Babylonians. And the cylinder was ostensibly written by the Babylonian priests of Marduk, but it's got all the markings of a piece of Persian propaganda. Towards the end of the inscription, Cyrus speaks in the first person. He declares himself to be king of the universe, the great king, the powerful king. It was a kind of Titanic moment, isn't it? King of the universe, the great king, the powerful king, king of Babylon, king of Sumer and Akkad, king of the 4 quarters of the world. And he goes on to say that his good deeds causes the god Marduk to rejoice, and who has restored to their sanctuaries the gods that Nabonidus, the deposed Babylonian king, had removed to Babylon. And this becomes a trope of a leader coming in and restoring what was rightfully theirs to the people who've been deprived, including moving the gods back into their cultic sanctuaries and rebuilding a special place, a temple. There's another contemporary text that talks about Cyrus in similar ways, talking about his restoration of non-Persian cult centers and his affiliation with their divinities. And that text is the Bible. In the book of Isaiah, Cyrus is described as both God's shepherd and the one who is anointed by God. And the Hebrew word for anointed by God is Mashiach, Messiah. And he is given that accolade for his part in the restoration of the Jews and the city of Jerusalem. And of course the term Mashiach builds an importance in the Jewish and Christian traditions. The biblical book of Ezra also records an edict of Cyrus, in which Cyrus states that he's been appointed by the God of heaven to build a temple for him in Jerusalem, and he encourages any exiles who want to return to Judah to help in this project of restoration. Ezra is a self-described scribe and priest of the God who is in heaven, and it obviously seemed to him that Cyrus had indeed been chosen by the God of Israel to fulfill that function. And of course Ezra is part of that activity. He is sent from the court of Artaxerxes II back to Jerusalem to take part in that restoration project. So, the question is, the conundrum is, if Cyrus is so beloved by the gods of the Babylonians and the Judean divinity, can he also be said to be Zoroastrian? Were these edicts that are attributed to Cyrus just an example of diplomatic respect that is shown for other religions and other peoples by the Persians? What do we know about Cyrus when he's on his home turf? So let's have a look. Where is his home turf? I'm sorry, I don't have a pointer. Are you able to read these? It's like Paddington Station. This is his home turf, right in the homeland of Pars in southwestern Iran. The palace complex that was built by Cyrus sometime after his conquest of the Lydians and continued after the conquest of the Babylonians. It was built, it's a dynastic capital that was built with the help of some of the various subject people. So you'd expect it to have a kind of hybrid building technique and forms. And one of those examples of hybrid symbolism is this four-winged figure. I'm sorry, that's not my picture. If you go now, it's covered with a great canopy, and I've only ever been there at high noon, so the relief is really hard to see. But I've given you a drawing on the right-hand side. It's an Elamite royal robe with a stripe down the middle, on a king who wears an Egyptian triple artef or hum-hum crown with the four wings that you would find on an Assyrian guardian spirit. It's a combination of elements of several ancient Near Eastern examples of royal iconography that are kind of molded together into this apotropaic gateway genius. And it seems that it was at this time that the Persians had no internal religiously figurative iconography of their own, nor did they have permanent religious structures. Herodotus attests with amazement, mid-5th century, late 5th century, that the Persians conducted worship outside, without images, without temples, without altars, because to them Zeus, that is the generic word for God, is the whole circle of the heavens. So of course you wouldn't expect to find a fire temple at this early stage. But what we do have at Pasargadae are two fire plinths. has anybody been to Pasargad? Yeah. Have you seen the fire plinths? You have to actually leave the compound and go all the way around to a little village. They're on the other side of a hill. So they're away from the palace complex a bit. And I got lost several times trying to get the coach through the little lanes of the village. These date to about the 6th century BCE. David Stronach talks about them in his archaeological report on Pasargad. And it's thought that there were stone fire holders that were placed on top of them in the same manner as you find illustrated on some of the ancient Persian tombs. This is in a carving over the tomb of Darius I and later Persian kings at Nakhchirovstan and at Persepolis. You find the monarch standing, I don't have a pointer, but can you see? He's standing on a 3-stepped plinth facing a fire, blazing in a fire holder that's also on a 3-stepped plinth. At the site at Pasargad, there were 3 such fire holders found, not next to the plinths, but spread out over the whole of the area. And one of them had a bowl that was deep enough to hold a thick bed of ash and that would have held a sustained burning wood fire. It's thought, I made one of the guides on our tours climb up in an attitude of kingship. The platforms of fire holders seem to have been designed so that the king could pray before the fire with appropriate dignity. And of course it's the fire holder that becomes the standard element in Iranian iconography from Darius I onwards. It appears on carvings and seals and eventually coins in the late Parthian period and going on into the Sasanian period, so that you have the stepped fire holder appearing. Thank you, Kayvon, for that. On imagery of Ardashir I, who was the first Sasanian king, onwards. And of course today fire is still an important emblematic element within a Zoroastrian place of worship. The name for a place of worship in Persian is Atashkadeh, the house of fire. It symbolises, of course, the ancient Iranian concept that is found in the Gathas of Asha, the cosmic order, the right path, or the truth that's inherent in the creative activity of Ahura Mazda. But from Herodotus onwards, non-Zoroastrians observing the prominence of fire in both Zoroastrian rhetoric and ritual have often mistakenly referred to Zoroastrians as fire worshippers, or Atash Parastan in Persian. But I would argue, and have done, that water is also a significant element in the earliest expressions of the Zoroastrian religion. It's found in the cosmogony of the Gathas. It's found in another older Western text called the Yasna Tanhaiti, the worship of the 7 sections, which seems to take the form of an offering to the good waters. And these are both, it's an older Western text, so it's pretty old. When Herodotus and later observers wrote about the religion of the ancient Persians, they always remarked on the particular reverence for rivers that was shown by the Persians, who tried to keep the waters pure by not polluting them. And at Pasargad, you have water channels defining the space between 2 palaces, providing a visual articulation of this worldview that humans and the natural world should be in a balanced and harmonious relationship. And David Stronach tells this wonderful story of being asked by one magazine to draw a plan of Pasargad, and he's sitting in one of the palaces looking out, and he suddenly realizes that he's looking at an example, the earliest known remnant of what became the classical Persian fourfold garden, with water, the source of life and growth, at its central feature. And this garden becomes a metaphor for paradise, Paradise is a word which derives from an old Iranian word, paradisa, in the Avestan, or an assumed paradida in Old Persian. In the Avesta, it means enclosure. In the Young Avestan book of the Vidavdad, enclosures were built to contain not good stuff, but pollution. The pollution of someone who had been supposed to carry a corpse and had somehow mishandled the corpse. So it was full of the pollution of death. So the enclosure was built to surround and enclose that person. And a few verses later, the Vidavdad states that such barren land was to be watered, and then seeds that would grow plants were to be planted. So the sense is that which was dead is meant to be made alive again. And the classical Greeks seem to have become really enamored of the idea of Persian gardens. The word they give to them are paradisoi, paradises, places of delight and entertainment. Xenophon is one of the earliest Greeks to provide a description of a Persian paradisos. He describes it as full of fruit-bearing trees, of animals and waters. And it's thought that Cyrus's garden at Pasargadae offers a small-scale model for such a paradisos. The fourfold garden design is represented throughout Iranian history in lots of different art forms, in poetry, in stone reliefs, in miniature paintings, and of course in carpets, such as here, as well as of course in actual gardens. If you go to London and you climb to the top of the Ismaili Centre, you will find a fourfold Persian garden on the rooftop there. This building to the south of Pasargadae is probably one of the most famous ancient Persian monuments. It's the tomb of Cyrus. The mausoleum stands on a platform that's raised on 6 tiered stone plinths, so that you look up at it from the ground. You can see how tiny the tourists are in relation to the huge edifice. The 3 lower tiers here are deeper than the next 3, so it's a ziggurat form but divided into 2 different parts. And then you've got the actual mausoleum on the top, which is like a Lydian house tomb. And it was my professor at SOAS, Mary Boyce, who came up with the notion that this is, of course, what she thought was an example of the trifold ethic of the Zoroastrians: good thoughts, good words, good deeds. In Avestan Humata Huchta Huvarsta, Antishenik, Goftarinik, Kerdarinik. Sometimes it's Pendarinik. Did you have a question?
Sorry, what country exactly is this in?
It's in southwestern Iran, in Pars province. So, if this is Cyrus's tomb, what evidence do we have that his remains were disposed of in a manner fitting with the Zoroastrian custom and practice? Well, we don't. In Young Avestan and Greek texts, the indication is that it was an Iranian custom to expose the dead, that is, to leave the body out, to be eaten by birds and animals, so that the elements of the world, particularly fire, earth, and water, were not polluted. And this is the exterior of what is thought to be the oldest known construction of a dakhma, a place of exposure. It's in Karakalpakstan, which is an autonomous region of northwestern Uzbekistan. It was constructed in the early part of the Common Era, 2nd century CE probably, with mud that was taken from the river Oxus all the way up the hill to make this great kind of fortress enclosure of the hill. I went up there a couple of years ago, and it's a really huge place. So there's no obvious area where the dead would have been exposed, but I was talking to Franz Grenet about the site, and he said, yes, it's definitely a hill of exposure, because where he was told that there were divisions for buildings, he could clearly see that there were divisions for men, women, and children in the interior. So this is an old practice. This is the interior of a much more recent dakhma, a 19th century one outside the city of Yazd. And this was used until the late 1960s, early 70s, when the Iranian Zoroastrians moved towards burial in a cemetery or an arungar. But we do know from Cyrus onwards that the ancient Persians were interred in rock-cut tombs, such as these in the cliffs at Naqsh Rustam, or in freestanding tombs such as that of Cyrus at Persiga. And that tells us that primary burial was also practiced by Western Iranians alongside exposure. And of course Herodotus also refers to the practice of burial of the body as well. It's been pointed out that perhaps the king had an elevated status, so he was less likely to pollute the elements. But also that this is, the walls and the roof is double thickness, the door would have all been made of thick stone, which would have prevented the decompositions of the body from entering into the earth or into water, and so not polluting the good creations. This notion of the king being affiliated, being kind of divinely sanctioned, is present in Old Persian inscriptions, which state that the kings ruled in the favour of Ahura Mazda, or with the aid of Ahura Mazda. One of Darius's first actions on becoming king was to publish the divine endorsement of his own rule in this rock relief and lengthy inscription. It's found at a place called Bizatun, or sometimes called Behistun. It's on the main road from the ancient capital of the Medes, Ecbatana, Hamadan, and this capital city of Babylon. Although it is 300 feet up in the air, so it's really hard. You couldn't read anything from below, but you could see this imagery if you climbed up a little bit. It's in the text that Darius commemorates his military victories and describes how the great god, Ahura Mazda, chose him to dethrone a usurper, to quell several subsequent revolts, and to establish himself as king. Ahura Mazda is the only deity called by name, and his role as establisher of the good is celebrated. Part of the text at Bizatun reads, I'm going to do my best Darius accent. For this reason Ahura Mazda bore me aid, as well as the other gods who are, because I did not side with the evil one. I was not a liar. I did nothing crooked, neither I nor my family. I wandered in straightness. This is an amazing statement by Darius. It emphasizes his own feeling of a moral imperative to choose to follow the straight path, to wander in straightness rather than taking the crooked, the bendy, the weavy, the path of chaos. And that's in keeping with the ethos of the Gathas, to promote good and to oppose evil. And when we're talking about links between the ancient Persians and the Avesta, you might want to consider reading a couple of the articles by Professor Shervo from Harvard, who has written about the close literary connection between the old Persian inscriptions and the old Avesta of the Gathas. Professor Shervo noticed that although the languages differ, just as the genres of text differ, there are many similarities between the description of the religion in such Achaemenid sources and those contained in the Avesta. And even the words that are used are very close. The word that, the old Persian word for the lie, is Drauga, which is it's cognate with the Avestan word druj, which is the lie. The similarity between ancient Persian and Avestan text is also found in some of the names of the ancient Persian leaders. Of the father and the son of Darius I were named Vishtaspa, Histaspes in the Greek text, and of course Vishtaspa pops up in the Gathas as the supporter of Zarathustra. And Darius' own name in Old Persian is Darayavahu, which means he who holds on to the good. And there's a strophe in the Gathas that says, Darayat vehishtam mano, he upholds the very best thought. And I did wonder, is Darius consciously mirroring this ethos in his own person when he asserts in the inscription by his tomb at Naqshi Rustam that he is not quick to anger, but is able to keep his temper under control through his power of thought, monah. Darius' understanding of his relationship to Ahura Mazda and the purpose of his rule is outlined in a passage that's found on this statue of Darius. It's the only 3D statue that we have. It was found at Susa, but it was obviously carved in Egypt. And it's a cosmogony. It's a passage about creation. A great god is Ahura Mazda, who created this earth, who created yonder sky, who created humanity, who created happiness for humanity, and who made Darius king. This is one of several Old Persian inscriptions that record the creation of the world by Ahura Mazda. The form this earth and that sky, or yonder sky, is found in the Young Avestan text of the Farvardiniasht. The notion that Ahura Mazda creates happiness or well-being for humans is, of course, present in the Gathas. In his various royal texts, Darius considers his mandate as Ahura Mazda's agent to be to rule the earth in wisdom. The Old Persian word he uses is khratu, so it's Avestan khratu, maintaining order and promoting happiness, health, and perfection for the kingdom as a whole. And that whole kingdom includes protecting the people, their homes, and their livestock from a hostile army, from famine, and from the lie. This tension between an ideal state of well-being and the threat of distress or discord that's caused by the incursion of bad stuff parallels the structural dichotomy of the Gathas, where there is tension between Asha, the world of order, the right path, the truth, and Druj, the way of chaos, confusion, and the lie. That the role of the Persian king remained central in upholding order can be found in the name of one of the later Persian kings, Artaxerxes, who in Old Persian is Artaxerxes, which means whose rule is through order. So Arta is the Old Persian cognate with the Old Avestan Asha. It's been suggested that this concept of divinely sustained order, which the king upholds, may be depicted in this hybrid iconography of the Byzantine relief, where a figure within a winged disc is depicted for the first time in a Persian context. The symbol derives, of course, from an Egyptian winged solar disc that's replicated then in Assyrian iconography of the sun god Shamash. This isn't an image of Shamash, this is thought to be an image of Ashur, one of the main Assyrian gods, who emerges from the solar disk. He's holding a bow in one hand and the other is raised in salutation. Shamash is also depicted in a similar way, sometimes holding a bow and sometimes holding a ring. In the Persian representation, the figure always wears Persian clothing and is always holding a ring of divinity, not the bow. It's interpreted in various ways. Some suggest that the figure, when it appears at Byzantine in this image, this image is Ahura Mazda, since Ahura Mazda is mentioned so much in the Byzantine inscription. Some say that it is the Fravashi, or the pre-soul of the king. Others say that when the image is shown wearing a crown that is very similar to the crown that the king wears below, that it's the far, the divine fortune or glory that resides with the king. If it is Ahura Mazda, this would run counter to Herodotus' notion that there was no iconographic representation of gods by the Persians. In modern lingo, it's called a Farahar, which is derived from the notion of it being a Fravashi. And that's debatable as to whether it actually is a Farahar. What is interesting is that this emblem, which is now so ubiquitous, isn't seen on any iconography from this time, from the ancient Persian period right down to the modern period. The fire is, but this isn't, and it pops up again. Monica Ring has written quite a bit about this, as has Talon Grigor. The notion of using ancient Iranian royal symbolism in the mid-19th century construction of fire temples, such as these in Kerman, Isfahan, and Yazd. In the Byzantine relief, Darius stands with his foot very firmly resting on the usurper, whose name is Galmata, who's identified in the inscription and also by Herodotus as a magus. Herodotus says that the Magi are a Median tribe, but he also talks about them as the religious practitioners of both the Medes and the Persians. The Magi, he says, poured libations, they presided at offerings to the gods, and they interpreted dreams. Xenophon later presents the Magi as the experts in all things religious, and he says that their establishment as a priestly order dates to the time of Cyrus. We have a slew of archives that come from Persepolis, the Persepolis fortification tablets that date to the late 6th, very early 5th centuries BCE, so during the time of Darius, and also seals that were found at Persepolis that tell us that the Magi were active in the neighborhood. They received rations of grains and jugs of wine as payment for performing libation services at named rivers and lakes, as well as for more mundane administrative duties throughout the empire. The Elamite word for these libations is dausha or daushiam. It's a linguistic and functional parallel to the Avestan concept of zauthra, which is a modern zor. So you have the ab zor, the libation to the water, or the atash zor, the libation to the fire. Several seals such as these depict Magi in a so-called Median dress, that's the tunic and trousers rather than the long Persian robe, and they're standing before a fire, which you can notice, I don't know whether you can see it clearly, but it's in a stepped base and stepped top, so it's very like the one that's above the tombs at Naqsh Rustam. They have, holding in one hand, they seem to be holding a staff, or it could be a bundle of rods that was the barsum. And the other hand is either raised in salutation or raised in front of the mouth to stop the breath from polluting the fire. In the archives and some other references, there is mention of a group of functionaries who were called Atar Vaksha, the guardians of the fire. So could these people be the guardians of the fire? There's a similar image that that was in Persepolis. These are found in Persepolis, which is in the Persian heartland. You find lots of other examples in Western Asia, and this one comes from Daskilyan. It's in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum. I don't know, did you see it at the ISIS conference in the summer? This is a funeral stele. and it seems to depict two magi with the same kind of hoods and covering over their mouths, holding thick wadges of balsam, the sacred rods, standing in front of the door, possibly the door to a tomb, with the head of a bull and a horned sheep on a plinth. We know that the priests wore mouth coverings because in the younger Western text, the Vidardad, it talks about the mouth covering, the paitidana, as an item that had to be worn by priests, and we assume that is so that their breath didn't pollute the fire. The Young Avesta, the Persepolis fortification tablets, and Greek texts all attest that ritual offerings of animals formed an integral part of the religion at this stage, although there may have been distinction between animals that were killed for consumption and those who were sacrificed for more exalted, less mundane reasons, such as a victory in battle. Herodotus records that after a sacrifice had been performed by the laity, pieces of the cooked meat were set out on tender grass and consecrated by a magus who chanted a theogony, a hymn to the gods. This suggests that although the priestly system was becoming more formalized, the laity remained intimately involved with ritual practice. According to Herodotus, the prayer offered by the laity at the sacrifice was not just for their own interests, but for good to ensue to all Persians, including the king. So this reflects an intimate connection between an act of offering and the notion of the increase of good, not just for oneself, but for the whole of the world. The priestly chanting of a theogony points to the existence of a liturgy that recapitulated the myth of the birth and regeneration of the cosmos, which of course became crystallized in the yasna. Do you want to open a door? It's really hot in here. And the yasna is an act of worship that is still performed each day in some of the main fire temples in India. And I just put this in so that you would see this is... I've got one page. This is a photo of modern Parsi, Indian Zoroastrian priests in India performing an act of offering the Artesh before the fire. And you can see that they still have the mouth covering, and that the barsam has now shrunk a little bit, but the main priest is holding it in his left hand here. See? So the iconography that we have is present as a lived reality into the modern period. Some Persepolis fortification tablets refer to the involvement of the Magi in a ritual known as the Lan ceremony, that's L-A-N. Lan is an Elamite term that's thought to be a general reference to an offering or an oblation. We know from the texts that the Lan was offered to Ahura Mazda, but not to Ahura Mazda alone. It was also offered to identifiable Yazatars such as Spenta Armaiti and Nariosan, as well as to named mountains and rivers, also to the Elamite god Humban, and to all the gods. Were these gods Iranian? Were they Iranian and Elamite? Who were they? We don't know. Walter Hinkelmann has written a whole dissertation, hefty dissertation, called The Other Gods Who Are, that deals with this whole conundrum. We know that these offerings were not just made by Iranian officials who were named as Magi, but they were also offered by Elamite religious officials named as Shatin. Both received rations for making this ritual offering. And the fact that it was offered to divinities of both cultures by priests of both cultures presents an intriguing overlap, I think, of performance and purpose. It brings an Elamite dynamic into the discussion of the ancient Near Eastern cultural milieu within which the ancient Persian religious identity developed. I thought when I first saw this, maybe it's an example of a Lan offering, which included small animals, flour, wine, fruit. But when I mentioned this to a local guide, he said, no, it just looks like the makings of a shish kebab to me. So, it's on the outside of Darius' palace at Persepolis. Several buildings were begun by Darius I, but completed by his son and heir Xerxes. In this relief from Persepolis, we see Xerxes enthroned, although some say that it's Darius on the throne and Xerxes behind him. I put that in so that you could see they conform to this ancient Persian type of having a full beard and curly hair and medium stature, no piercings like you find in the 300. When I said that Herodotus is a biased account, sometimes it's important to look at the internal iconography as well as external text. To the north of the terrace at Persepolis, Xerxes constructed this imposing entryway, which is named as an inscription as the Gate of All Nations, which was built by the favour of Ahura Mazda. All visitors to the palace complex at Persepolis had to pass through this double gateway on their way to the throne hall to pay homage, tribute perhaps, to the king. It symbolises the ancient Persian king's self-perception of their kingdom as located at the centre of the world, not just of the Aryas, of the Iranians, but also of the non-Aryas. And what happens when that harmony at the centre is threatened? This is a text, one of several, that was generated by Xerxes, in which Xerxes records that he destroys a place dedicated to false gods, dedicated to divers, and that he established worship of Ahura Mazda according to Arta, that is Asha, in its place. And this emphasis on the primary of Ahura Mazda and the denouncing of the devas is thoroughly belonging to a Gothic ethos. It's one of the things that, it's a trope that continues throughout the profession of the Zoroastrian religion. That is, Ahura Mazda is the focus of worship, and the false gods are, and the evil, the confusion, the chaos that they bring to the world is to be avoided. The suggestion is that these divers are seen as an internal threat, a threat from within. They represent the old Iranian gods that had been rejected in the Gathas, but that for some had continued to be the focus of attention and worship. This kind of Achaemenid affirmation of Ahura Mazda and the life-giving beings associated with him is confirmed through the existence of an official religious calendar that's found in Cappadocia, referred to in Cappadocia. It replaced local calendars sometime in the 5th century. In the Avestan calendar, the 12 months were named after the Yazatars, including Haravatat, Amaratat, that's wholeness and immortality, Atar, fire, Vohumana, good thought, Tistria, a Yazatar of the rains, of fertility, and Mithra. And that calendar functioned in the region until at least the 4th century of the Common Era. Final image. I'm sorry, half an hour is not enough time to summarize and evaluate all the relevant material relating to the worldview of the ancient Persians. And we didn't even begin to look at Artaxerxes II and the whole question of Anahita. If you want to know more, you can read this book, or this book. Both expand on some of that information. I don't really have time for questions, but thank you.
If anybody's interested to get the book autographed, this one that has shown up in the bookstore rather than the other one, if some of you please go ahead and purchase it if you want to have it signed. And I think anybody who has questions, please, can also ask questions. Please raise your hand. Ask the questions. So please, anybody has questions, raise your hand.
Yes.